with the conference, and in this opportunity we have the keynote speaker, the first one, coming from the Miriam Masaquiza. Could you come over here so they can see you? You're short like me, so yes. Yeah, it is an immense pleasure for me to introduce Miriam to this forum. I met Miriam several years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, actually during the Quechua Alliance there. And then from there we keep our communication connections, sometimes through social media. And when I also went to the United Nations, to the Permanent Forum, I attended. And so we had another conversation briefly there. So this is it's an honor, a real honor to have her with us today. Now I'll say something more formal about her. Miriam Masaquiza is from the Indigenous People and Development Branch Secretariat of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Miriam Masaquiza Jerez is a Quechua woman from Salasaca, one of the indigenous people in Ecuador. Miriam possesses extensive knowledge and experience in areas impacting indigenous peoples, including gender issues, indigenous women, climate change, culture and education matters, interagency relations, outreach and communication management, and political analysis. She brings over 20 years of professional experience at the international level. She is currently a senior social affairs officer in the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch at the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues within DESA. In this role, she oversees the implementation of the forum's mandate and leads substantive work on indigenous issues at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Before this, Miriam served as an advisor at Ecuador's Ministry of Cultural and National Heritage, where she provided invaluable insights. Notably, she made history as the first indigenous diplomat in the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations in New York. Additionally, Miriam served as an advisor at the cabinet of the presidency during the 63rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. From 2024 to 28, Miriam worked as Associate Social Affairs Officer at the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues in DESA, contributing significantly to the forum's initiatives and operations. Before joining the Secretariat, she was actively involved in one of the three main national indigenous peoples organizations in Ecuador and undertook consultancy work for the International Fund, Agricultural Development, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Miriam is fluent in Quechua, her indigenous language, as well as Spanish and English. It is, again, a real honor to have her with us today, and let's receive Miriam with a big round of applause.
Imanaya tukuykuna allipunlla ñukakshutimikang Miriam Masaquiza, Jerez, Ecuador mamayaktamanta mishamuni, kaymikan ñukak runashimi Quichua nishka. Shinalladik kaypi shuk kilkayta rurashkani kikinkunama, kaida kangonamu karasha. With the permission of our elders and Mother Earth, I would like to thank Indiana University for inviting me to the first conference on global indigenous studies from multiple perspectives. And I would like to, of course, recognize indigenous peoples from this land, the Potawatomi, Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware. I deeply appreciate this important space for amplifying our diverse voices and for the opportunity to share from my life experience what I have learned in over 20 years of supporting indigenous peoples advocacy at the United Nations. I would like to also acknowledge the long struggle of indigenous peoples around the world. The achievement of the indigenous peoples movement would not have been possible without local and national efforts that brought attention to international and regional processes alongside the support of non-governmental organizations and, of course, the academia. I want to begin by saying that I am Quichua from Ecuador. My people is called Salasaca. We are located in South America, of course. And in Salasaca, we still speak Quichua, and our ancestral culture and customs remain alive in our daily lives, where principles of collectivity and reciprocity with the land are fundamental in our community. However, I must also say that today there is a growing tendency to lose our identity, especially among the young generations, leading us to undervalue our own heritage in favor of modern and Western knowledge. Dear friends, for indigenous peoples, time is not linear. Rather, we perceive it is a cycle or continuous connections between different moments. That is, the past, the present, and the future are interconnected. And these events connects one to another moment. With this in mind, I would like to point out that 100 years ago, the attempt by the Cayuga chief, Descajen, to address the League of Nations in Geneva in 1923 to defend the rights of his people to live accordingly to their own laws on their lands and under their faith was a crucial milestone in the history of indigenous peoples' rights and their relationship with international systems such as the UN, the United Nations. Over the decades, the work initiated by Descajen was carried forward by other indigenous leaders at the UN, especially with the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in the year 2000. Descajen's effort laid the groundwork for indigenous peoples to be recognized today as subjects of rights and political actors within the United Nations international mechanisms, actively participating in the promotion of human rights, self-determination, and the protection of territories. To continue, let me briefly walk you through some milestone events at the UN that shaped the international indigenous rights agenda. In 1970 to 1984, the Subcommission on Human Rights initiated a crucial study titled on racial discrimination. It was recognized, this study, as highly valuable contribution to clarifying the basic legal, social, and cultural issues related to indigenous populations. That was done by a staff member named Augusto Williamson Diaz, a staff member that's similar to me maybe at that time. This study was prepared based in visits and also information received from 37 countries. In 1981, 1982, some meetings were held related to indigenous peoples and lands, and also the issue of ethnocide. In 1985, the working group on indigenous populations already started working and decided that the first step for the recognition of indigenous peoples should be the work on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 1993, the International Year on Indigenous Peoples was established, and at that time, this declaration was adopted, this draft, I would say. In 1994, the UN launched the first decade on indigenous populations, which included a call to establish a United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. From 1995 to 2006, the Commission on Human Rights formed an open-ended working group to work on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that finally was adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2006. In 2001, it was established the mechanism named Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These milestones highlight the evolving recognition and institutional support for indigenous peoples within the UN, making crucial steps towards the formal acknowledgement of indigenous rights on a global scale. While these important events were unfolding, I would like to briefly first focus and share a personal experience. In 2000, I applied for a fellowship program for indigenous peoples organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. By that time, I had returned from studying English in the United States of America and was working with one of the national indigenous organizations in Ecuador. This organization nominated me for the program, and after an interview, I was honored to be selected as one of the fellows, alongside 4 other indigenous youth from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. I arrived in the summer of 21, and while immersing myself in the workings of the United Nations, and specifically learning what was the efforts of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had the opportunity to attend one of the working groups on indigenous populations at that time, which was established, as I mentioned, in 1982. This working group met annually for 5 days and was composed by 5 experts. The final product of each meeting was a report and was sent to the Subcommission on Human Rights, then reviewed by the Commission and ultimately presented to the General Assembly. Indigenous peoples often joked that this working group within the UN organizational structure represented the basement of the United Nations building. However, over time, this working group paved the way for the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights, which would later culminated in the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted in 2007. During this period, 3 specific mechanisms were established: the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2000, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2001, after the adoption of the Declaration, and the expert mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples in 2008. It is worth noting that based on the recommendations of these three mechanisms, the need for the participation of indigenous peoples has been strengthened not only in this, but also other mechanisms of the United Nations system. And by the way, I would like also to recognize that Ms. Elisa Kanki, who is present in this room, she was one of the members of this expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And thank you, Elisa, for being here. At that time, I went from being a fellow to a consultant with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which gave me the great opportunity to serve the first session of the Permanent Forum. In 2003, I became an international servant in the UN Secretariat, supporting the work of the Permanent Forum, the challenges for the newly established Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which was hosted by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, at the UN headquarters in New York, were enormous. For the small team and me, the task was to align with the aspirations of indigenous peoples who had been inspired by Chief Descagen in 1923 in his trip to the League of the Nations. Let me tell you a little bit about the establishment of the Permanent Forum. It's a milestone in the long struggle of indigenous peoples to be recognized within the international system, and especially within the UN. Indigenous peoples has been demanding for years of high-level mechanisms within the UN system where their right to participate would be fully recognized, not just as observers. Finally, with the forum, that demand became a reality. The role of the Secretariat of the Forum was clear: to facilitate the implementation of the Forum's mandate as a global platform for the defense and protection of indigenous people's rights. This platform was created by and for indigenous peoples to meet and dialogue with both UN agencies and representatives of states, NGOs, academics, and others working on these issues. Over the time, the Permanent Forum gained legitimacy and consolidated itself as a central space for indigenous people's voices and demands. When the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, both the Forum and other two mechanisms for indigenous peoples were significantly strengthened. The declaration called on states, the UN system, to implement these rights promptly, effectively, and in partnership with indigenous peoples. For indigenous peoples, the adoption of it was an historic moment. Affirming their inherent rights and sovereignty. In this process, ILO Convention number 169 also played a crucial role. Together, these instruments have empowered indigenous peoples to assert their rights, ranging from the most fundamental for their survival, such as their rights to lands and resources, to the right to participate in political processes and to define their relationship with states. In 2008, I made a significant shift in my journey, stepping away from the UN to explore new opportunities. I returned to Ecuador for a while and became a diplomat for the government of Ecuador. I had the privilege of serving in the cabinet of the president during the 63rd session of the UN General Assembly. It was a time of learning and growth, full of new challenges and experiences that deepened my understanding of how things work within the state and its mechanisms. This experience gave me a fresh perspective on governance, diplomacy, and the intrinsic balance between national interests and international relations. But in 2010, my path led me back to the UN. Over the years, I have been fortunate to support with my knowledge of various processes and witness many of the forum's recommendations come to life. I have seen the establishment of the second International Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the adoption of the resolution for Indigenous women at the Commission on the Status of Women in 2012, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014, the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019, and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages from 2022 to 2032. One moment that truly remarked my life, I would say, was the moment when CEDAW finally adopted a general recommendation number 39, recognizing the rights of Indigenous women and girls. This recommendation had been in the works since 2003, when the forum recommended it. And after many years of advocacy and effort, its adoption felt like a monumental milestone in our ongoing journey towards true recognitions and justice for Indigenous women. Looking back, this road hasn't been easy, but each step has been a powerful reminder of the resilience, strength, and unwavering determination of Indigenous peoples to challenge and transform the system that have held us back for so long. Here, I just wanted to show you all these evolving times. Dear friends, allow me to share another example. During the preparatory process for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, work together under the principles of equality, mutual respect, and constructive dialogue. From the earliest stages of preparation to the negotiation and adoption of the outcome document, there was a concerted effort, unlikely even before, to ensure the active participation of Indigenous peoples. Although the conference was held within the rules and procedures of the General Assembly, Indigenous peoples succeed in creating a meaningful space for dialogue and advocacy. Some examples. Their participation as peoples, with S, was recognized through representatives elected by them to participate in the consultation process and in the negotiations of both the modalities resolution and the outcome document of the conference. 2. The UN hosted more than 1,500 Indigenous delegates from all over the world, the 7 sociocultural regions, who participated in the consultations of the conference itself, organized by the President of the General Assembly. 3. Indigenous peoples were able to nominate speakers and co-chairs from their 7 sociocultural regions, who participated in the program of the World Conference. This conference was a milestone, not only because it was a high-level meeting, but also because it resulted in a concise and active-oriented outcome document developed through inclusive and open consultations between member states and Indigenous peoples. This process showed what can be achieved with genuine dialogue, where both states and Indigenous peoples relaxed UN procedures to ensure real participation. All along the way, Indigenous peoples held firm to their motto, nothing about us without us. The outcome document includes crucial commitments such as the creation and implementation of national action plans, the promotion and consultations to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, and the collection of disaggregated data reflecting holistic indicators on indigenous issues, among others. As a follow-up to the World Conference, indigenous peoples have remained resolute in their demand for greater participation at the UN. During 2016 and 17, in New York, specific measures were explored to improve their participations in the United Nations General Assembly, ECOSOC, and the Human Rights Council. At the Human Rights Council, of course, some achievements, some steps have been taking place. While no decision was made at that time, the process has continued to evolve with side events, hearings, expert workshops, and international meetings taking place both in New York and in Geneva. It's been a long journey, but the ongoing efforts reflect a growing trust between indigenous peoples and member states. In September 2024, the General Assembly adopted a resolution which continues its consideration of further measures necessary to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant meetings at the UN. And this discussion will continue during September 2025 and 2026. In 2017, the General Assembly also adopted two important documents where there are specific references to indigenous peoples. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda that recognize traditional knowledge as key and fundamental for to support sustainable livelihood, while also emphasizes the importance of focusing on indigenous peoples in the context of social protection. Similarly, the Paris Agreement highlighted the importance of indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge in addressing climate change. Additionally, under UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, and CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, two important bodies were established to discuss climate change, traditional knowledge, and biodiversity conservation. The Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform Facilitative Working Group that was established in 2018, and recently in Cali, Colombia, the adoption of the subsidiary body on Article HJ. Dear friends, alongside ongoing efforts in the international arena, indigenous peoples have steadily advanced in their pursuit of visibility, inclusion, and political participation. However, the challenges they face have been significant. These range from strengthening their organizations to gaining a voice and vote in decisions that affect them, all in an effort to play an active role in shaping democracy and transforming nation states to reflect their pluricultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual identities. So I would like to highlight some of these challenges and contradictions observed at the national level across many states and offer a few recommendations. The inclusion of indigenous peoples' rights in policy priorities is hindered by their diversity and the weak governance of natural resources, particularly in regions heavily dependent on these resources. Therefore, it is crucial to make indigenous peoples' rights a central policy focus and enhance governance systems to better address these diverse needs. Conflicts over territory and resources stem from gaps in recognizing indigenous territorial rights, consultation, free, prior, and informed consent, and full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. The challenge is to redesign governance frameworks to establish long-term pacts that balance the interest of the states, the market, and indigenous peoples in resources management, moving from new deals to new pacts. The diversity within indigenous peoples' organizations and political currents leads to difficulties in consolidating efforts across subregions, creating gaps between local struggles and international actions. Strengthening coordination between local and global movements is essential, as well as align national policies with international standards. Conflicting policies around the ideal of goodwilling of living or living well, we called Sumacausay in our Quechua language, recognized in various state legislations, have had a dual effect. They have promoted the preservation of natural resources while also encouraging harmful extractive practices that affect indigenous lands. It is crucial to foster broader discussions on the relationships between extractive industries and indigenous peoples with a focus on identifying areas of common ground. The application of self-identification criteria in national censuses varies significantly, limiting the ability to use the data effectively in public policy. Therefore, there is a need to disaggregate census data by ethnicity, sex, and age, ensuring its proper use to inform inclusive public policy development. Despite these challenges, indigenous peoples in their relations with the political systems of nation states have applied strategies ranging from political mobilizations to advocacy for change in legal frameworks that regulate their relationship with these nation states. In addition, they have sought the definition of public policies and the creation of autonomous systems that contribute to the exercise of their right to self-determination. Examples of this can be seen in Kunalaya indigenous peoples of Panama, the Miskito, the Mayangu, and Rama of Nicaragua, and the Inuit in Greenland, among others. In closing, I urge the academic community, non-governmental organizations, civil society, and states to continue demonstrating solidarity and supporting the aspirations of indigenous peoples. This support must respect their right to define and establish their own priorities and strategies in exercising their right to development grounded in their own visions. From the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we remain committed to supporting the implementation of indigenous people's rights indicated in the declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Miriam, for providing us this rich context about the United Nations Permanent Forum and the mission and vision of the United Nations worldwide. I think it's very important. I think we have perhaps time for a couple of questions if you would like to. Yes. Yes, could you raise your voice? Or
Yes, professors know how to present. So, first of all, immense and heartfelt thanks. I think the more we see.
Yeah. No.
So thank you once again, and I'm sure you have heard this sentence a million times, that the more of women from different indigenous groups that we see in platforms and pedestals. It is beyond possibly to even explain that how much of motivation it provides to each one of us. My quick question is around the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Where do you think we are in 2025, especially in this context? Where are we, and what kind of roles at the community level and at indigenous people's voices levels, participation levels is happening? And if there are any thoughts towards even indigenizing some of those goals, like some of those indicators from an indigenous lens.
Should I just respond? Okay, perfect. As you know, at the UN, it's very, all what I tell you this morning, it has been a long journey. And of course, even I just highlighted here that indigenous peoples were mentioned 6 times, 3 times in the political declaration, 2 in the targets under Goal 2 on zero hunger, and in Goal 4 on education, and 1 in the section of follow-up and review that calls for indigenous people's participation. So this is really crucial, because at the beginning of the discussions, we were only mentioned 3 times, and indigenous peoples come to the UN and start talking to states, and that's why we have this product. It is really crucial, of course, what's going on at national level. And one key entry point is when member states prepare their national voluntary reviews that they do annually, and they usually announced by this time which countries would be presenting their national reviews. The Permanent Forum has been crucial in recommending that the indigenous peoples at national level should be participating in these processes. But of course, sometimes in some countries, this never happened. So that's why indigenous peoples organizations is key, and I would say even the academia, because if you notice that this is missing, I think it's really important to approach indigenous peoples organizations and come together and try to prepare these kind of calls, shadow reports, that of course would be very useful. And now in terms of, as I mentioned, disaggregated data, it has been really, really difficult. And again, the Permanent Forum at that time, they were very loud and clear, saying that this must be according to the ethnicity rights. And they start a process, especially for our region. I would say it's kind of the most advanced in papers sometimes, that it was very interesting and see how these institutes for census have included the criteria of ethnicity, I would say. So this also helped a lot in order to know how many indigenous peoples, where they are, what it's needed. But also, in some cases, indigenous peoples come to the forum and say that even though they have this information, they don't know how to use it. And again, here is very important, the academia, because you guys know and you produce different studies, and it would be important to kind of, together with indigenous peoples, try to see on how to teach, I would say, to advise states on how this important data should be used, and then how the methodology to implement these important tools to obtain this data should be implemented in indigenous peoples' territories. That I could say. I'm not sure if anybody have other question?
I'm glad to be here. My name is Mark. I'm from Bangladesh, indigenous people. But some country like Bangladesh, the indigenous people are not even allowed to introduce themselves as indigenous. So, like Bangladesh government, they say you are hill people. So we have to become like a hill people. Now then sometimes they get money from United Nations, I guess. They say, oh, you are indigenous. So we all became indigenous. Now another government came, no, you are not indigenous anymore. Now we are small tribe. The name is in small ethnic. In fact, all indigenous word is removed. So as you are a permanent member in the United Nations, in this kind of situation, do you have any chance to talk to the United Nations to tell the government that you should not do like that? We want, let the indigenous people introduce themselves as an indigenous however they want. We don't want to be told by you are these people, you are not this. We want to be who we are. So this kind of situation, if you can bring it, things to the light. Also, I'm talking it, I'm not even safe talking these things. Thank you.
Yeah, actually I wanted to show you very briefly here. Here is the Permanent Forum webpage, and we have a database of recommendations. So if you click here, you will actually get all the recommendations related to specific issues. And let me see if I can find what I wanted to show you. So you will see that there are several recommendations related to the situation of the Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh. Even the Permanent Forum prepared a study related to that, and it was not working, unfortunately, the link on the webpage, but we can bilaterally discuss. But yes, through the Asia Caucus, they have a strong presence, and they have bring to the attention of the forum the situation on different situations. And recently, actually, the Permanent Forum issued a statement related to the events that happened in September, that probably you know better than me. And this, for example, it's really, really crucial, because that's the way how the Permanent Forum mention and highlight the situation of indigenous peoples related to a particular issue. And this, this is the statement, what happened with the indigenous Yuma people. And then, of course, you are certainly you are more knowledgeable about me on how in some countries, some states, of course, they said that they have indigenous peoples, and some they say that they don't have indigenous peoples, that everybody is indigenous peoples. But at the United Nations, at least what we are trying to say is that indigenous peoples in each countries, they exercise their self-identification, and the terms indigenous peoples with S is a term that is used by the UN as a common term to discuss what is going on with these particular groups, peoples, communities in different parts of the world. But yes, if you have any specific questions, I really would like to call to your attention to check the recommendation database, because also if you are coming from the academia, if you are interested in preparing a study or working on some particular issues, please go to this database, because here you will find exactly what indigenous peoples are asking for and what they would like that you can come and ask to them. Because as I mentioned before, it's really important to work with them together, not go and impose on them of what you think you would like to do or what do you want to research. It's important to see and ask them what they are their needs. Any other question? I think it's already 12, but.
Imanaya, Miriam. My name is Amy Chalan. I am an indigenous young Quechua woman, also hailing from Ecuador, and just so much admiration and respect for your work, and look up to you as a young woman who's hoping to also be in this world of advocacy and change at many levels. I had two questions. One, I think, was regarding, from my perspective as a young person that's looking at the whole ecosystem of advocacy and resistance, and navigating places like academia. I've also been fortunate enough to also be at the Permanent Forum the last 2 years for the first time. One question I think I struggle with, and that I think resonates with a lot of folks in the room, is how to keep that connection to the essence of the work, because a lot of times when we're navigating these systems, we're often translating concepts, translating across languages, but also across worldviews, and a lot of times the essence of the communities that we come from, like you were mentioning, collectivity, reciprocity, makipurashpa, giving each other a hand, like those are not necessarily alive and palpable every day while we're doing our work. So that first question is, how do you maintain that connection to your essence as a Salasaca woman, but being in New York, being transnational? And then my second question had a little bit more to do with the urgent contemporary diversity of experiences of indigenous people, thinking specifically about the Quechua people that are urban, that are migrating. There's a lot of ways in which both the Ecuadorian census and even what you were talking about with disaggregating data, we fall through the cracks because our contemporary situations are almost outpacing the structures that exist. So the second question would be a little bit more about, how do you balance in your role the very fast-paced nature of globalization and how our contemporary situations are changing and diversifying, with the fact that the United Nations is also working on long-term sustainable mechanisms that are gonna outlast and hopefully adapt to our changing environments. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I think I mentioned that the United Nations is composed by member states, and that's the reality, and there are rules and procedures that we need to respect and follow. And that's why indigenous peoples are still struggling to have a seat within this entity, even though we know that they are self-governments, they are also similar states, I would say. Regarding the first question, I believe that in my case, I would say, even though I am an international servant, and when I go to meetings, I of course have to be a UN staff member. And I will tell you or talk to you as a staff member. However, I am also a Quechua, as I said, and that's perhaps the beauty for me sometimes to understand several discussions within this enormous house, which is the United Nations. But of course, there are so many issues that I am not expert, or I don't know all these different discussions. But what I can tell you for sure is that I always try to bring to my to what I am listening, what I used to do in my hometown, and also what I am hearing from these many years now. I would say more than 20, listening what is happening at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. But of course, at the beginning, I didn't understand. I didn't even know that there was the UN there. When I arrived in 2001, I was like, okay, so I didn't know that there was an international indigenous movement working for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But I learned little by little. And I think that's really important to listen what the elders who attend these meetings, who were their perspectives, what they were aspiration and thoughts were at that time, and try to keep that in your heart and in your mind. Because the UN is an entity that it's going to be always there, like this institution. But it's up to us to change that institution and try to navigate. And as I learned, I would say in 3 words, because I was born as a Quichua Salasaca, and at the year of 5 years old, I was pushed to study Spanish in a school that was totally different to mine, and I survived, and I learned how to navigate. After that, I finished my high school in another city. I guess my parents wanted to give me the tool to learn how to speak well Spanish, because they knew that this discrimination was very, very strong. And then after that, I left my community, I left my family, and I departed to another country, which was here in Seattle, Washington. I was just telling a friend that I found here. And also I started learning this language that it's not mine, but now I understand is that the language of diplomacy, because English is the only way how you can read and understand what the others are thinking about you indigenous peoples or others in the countries. So I think each indigenous person everywhere needs to learn how to navigate in this country without leaving behind who we are, our identity. And that's what I did, and what I am trying to do. And I am even very happy to have my daughter here, and I hope that one day she will continue this struggle, because probably I would not be here if my grandfather or my mom didn't decide that a woman should be educated and should be going to study to do all this work. Probably that was my, I would say, that's what I need to do it, because others in our countries are continue struggling, are continuing working very hard. And my role and what I would like to do and continue doing is to support and as much as possible on what I am doing. So I am not sure if I respond what you ask, but yeah, that's what I can say. Thank you.
One last question, please. No?
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much again, Miriam. Please give many rounds of applause. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're gonna have lunch now. It's lunchtime. I think there's a lunch boxes. Yes. Yes, the boss in the back will guide you. Thank you again for your presence.